Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the mud. Quite literally, because the medieval street is not the kind of place where you'd want to walk barefoot. The smell alone would make you reconsider every romantic idea you might have about cobblestone alleys. You know those cute tourist photos of little stone lanes in Europe? Imagine the same thing, but ankle deep in sewage, mixed with horse droppings, and that sweet aroma of yesterday's fish market rotting in the sun. And here you are, trying to stay alive. Spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't. You'd take one look at this chaos and tap out within the hour or so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop me a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Nothing makes me happier than hearing that someone in, say, Michigan at 11:42 p.m. drifted off halfway through my rambling. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing there, in the middle of the street, with a body that does not bend or move the way others expect it to. Maybe you limp, maybe one hand curls in tight, maybe your eyes wander in directions they shouldn't. Whatever it is, the medieval crowd doesn't see you as simply human. You are entertainment, a warning sign. Or if you're lucky, a person worth a coin. The first thing you learn is survival by spectacle. Begging is an art form here. It's not enough to hold out your hand. You must perform need itself. Some people sing with cracked voices, others recite scraps of scripture, and some turn their twisted limbs into theater, exaggerating their movements so that the crowd feels both pity and curiosity. Strange thing is, the louder the performance, the heavier the purse. Doesn't sound fair. Well, it wasn't single quotes pissing with tradesmen, shouting prices. Between a fishmonger slapping cod onto a stall and a tanner waving flies away from dripping hides. There you are, crouched low, chanting a rhyme you half remember. The sound of laughter comes not because the rhyme is funny, but because your body makes people uncomfortable and they mask it with cruel amusement. And if you think TikTok comments can be harsh, wait until you meet a medieval fishwife with zero filter. Sometimes, though, the crowd tosses a coin. It clinks against the stones, rolling to your foot, and in that moment you have won your day's bread. Just bread, mind you. Not a warm house, not a blanket just enough to keep your stomach from gnawing itself. And you accept it like it's gold, because here, bread is gold. Now. Here's a detail most people don't know. In some towns, authorities allowed or even licensed begging. There were official beggars tied to parishes, assigned to certain corners like grim franchise spots. Imagine applying for a permit to beg. Sorry, this corner is already taken. Try next to the dung heap. Bureaucracy at its finest. Historians argue about how strict these systems really were, but either way, it wasn't as freewheeling as movies suggest. Even misery had paperwork. Still, not every onlooker was cruel. Some feared you not because of who you were, but because they believed your condition was contagious, or worse, a mark of sin. A hunched back could be seen as punishment from heaven, and crossing your path might feel like brushing against divine anger. Others thought you could bless them if they gave you a coin, like tossing change into a fountain. Protection money, but with rosary beads. And then there were days when you were invisible. People stepped over you, skirts brushing your shoulders, carts rattling by so close the wheels nearly pinched your fingers. That's when you realize invisibility isn't peace. It's erasure. You'd almost prefer the insults. because at least then you existed. Here's a cruel little irony. Festivals were your best business days, while nobles paraded in velvet and peasants got drunk on weak ale. You could rake in more coins in one night than a whole week of silent begging. Not because people were kinder, but because laughter and spectacle dulled their guard. A twisted limb looks funnier after 3 tankards of beer. Imagine a medieval Mardi Gras, but instead of bead necklaces, you're hoping for copper pennies. At the same time, you live in constant negotiation with danger. Pickpockets target even beggars. Yes, really. Some thief might yank the coin you just earned, because who's going to defend you? The city guard. They're more likely to chase you away for disturbing the peace. Think of it like being robbed and then fined for standing there in the first place. Welcome to medieval customer service. But survival also had its small strategies. Some beggars paired up, one singing, the other gathering coins. Others placed themselves near churches, where guilt ran highest and wallets loosened easiest. And sometimes, if fortune smiled, a merchant or craftsman saw you as useful an errand boy. A workshop hand, someone who, despite everything, could still carry water or sweep floors. Not glamorous, but better than hunger. The truth is, your life is one long balancing act between pity and cruelty. The street is both your stage and your prison, where every day you gamble on human decency and hope it lands on the right side. And if you're listening to this, thinking how unfair it sounds, well, you're right. But remember, unfairness was baked into the medieval cobblestones. You shuffle forward, the damp of yesterday's rain still clinging to your clothes. And before you even open your mouth, the crowd has already found you. Their eyes land on you as if you were not flesh and blood, but some strange mirror they'd rather not look into. The butcher's boy pauses with his basket, smirks, and whispers something to his friend that makes them both laugh. The woman selling apples pulls her shawl tighter, as though your presence alone might spread like a draught. And yet, now and then, a coin arcs through the air, landing near your feet with a dull metallic thud. Not generosity, exactly, more like a way to quiet the uneasy hum inside their chests, as if by tossing silver they could silence guilt. The gaze is heavy, isn't it? Not quite pity, not quite disgust. Something in between, sticky like the mud clinging to your shoes. You notice how the eyes linger longer when you sing, when you make your voice wobble or tilt your head just so. People pay attention to novelty, to anything that disrupts their walk from stall to stall. In those moments, you are both entertainment and warning sign. There but for fortune go I, they seem to think. Even if they never say it aloud, no one can quite agree what they're looking at. Some swear they see God's trial etched into your bent frame. Others mutter about bad omens, as though your very shadow could sour the milk. The strange thing is even scholars, centuries later, still can't pin down whether medieval onlookers felt more fear or fascination when they stared. The records are blurred, written by men who often watched from the safer side of the street. And here's a curious truth that hides between the lines of dusty chronicles in certain towns. The place where you begged was almost official, not just tolerated, but assigned, as if the city itself had carved a little corner for you to exist in public view. Imagine that chore body and presence woven into the market's daily scenery, like a juggler's tricks or the bell of a church tower. Not kindness, exactly, but recognition that you could not simply be wished away. Still, the gaze could turn sharp in an instant. One slip, one wrong word, and a coin might be replaced by a thrown onion or a boot nudging you aside. children copied what they saw, their laughter louder, crueler, because cruelty was safe when it mirrored their parents. You become aware of every twitch in your hand, every stumble, because here every gesture is a performance under an open sky. It's strange, isn't it, how eyes alone can trap you? You might think chains or locked doors are what confine people, but in the medieval street, it was the unblinking stare that held you still. Even when someone dropped a penny into your palm, the weight of it was lighter than the stare that came with it. You could almost hear the unspoken words, "Thank you for being worse off than me," and yet you adapt. You learn which faces are more likely to soften after dusk, when lanterns glow and the day's business is done. You discover how to time your song just as a wealthy cloth merchant passes, because even if he looks through you most days, tonight he might be walking with his mistress, and he'll pay handsomely just to seem magnanimous. Survival lies in reading the gaze as much as in earning the coin. There's a certain theater in all of this, though you didn't choose the role. Picture yourself half a stage away from the actors of daily life, hawkers shouting, buyers haggling, children darting under carts, and you standing at the edges, performing by existing. Sometimes the crowd chuckles at your persistence. Sometimes they recoil. The play continues, and you are both actor and prop. Of course, not every glance was cruel. A few eyes lingered with something quieter. A baker's apprentice slipping you a roll while his master looked the other way. A mother pressing her child's hand into yours for a moment, murmuring a blessing. Those rare looks stitched small seams of humanity into the rough fabric of the day. Still, the truth remains. Life on the street was lived under the gaze of others, and that gaze shaped who you were allowed to be. Step out of sight, and you risked invisibility. Stay too visible, and you risked becoming spectacle. A fragile balance, held together by glances that weighed more than any chain. And so, as you walk, you can feel the street itself breathing with eyes. They track you like smoke rising from a chimney, curling and dispersing, but never fully gone. You wonder if those eyes ever truly saw you, the person behind the bent spine and patched cloak. Would it matter? Or would the weight of centuries keep them staring, coins clinking, laughter echoing as you bow your head and move along? By now, you've grown almost used to the stare of the market crowd. Almost, but there are other eyes heavier, grander, gilded with gold, that can change your fate in stranger ways. Word drifts through muddy alleys like smoke. A court official passed by. Noticed the way you made the crowd laugh with your lopsided bow, or the wobble in your step that seemed almost rehearsed. And suddenly, you're summoned beyond the gates, into halls where stone walls echo with polished footsteps and silk rustles like whispers. Here. The gaze is sharper, dressed in velvet and authority. The nobles lean back in their carved chairs, studying you as though you were part puzzle, part amusement. Their smiles are practiced, their laughter timed. You're not entirely sure if they see you as a human being or as a curiosity. No different from the exotic bird in a golden cage, or the dwarf-sized lute displayed as decoration. It is a strange theater, more dangerous than the marketplace. On the street, you might be mocked. Here, you might be kept collected, even. Some rulers adored, surrounding themselves with oddities, turning their courts into living cabinets of wonder. The chroniclers rarely linger on how you felt about it, but the records do mention names, titles, payments. There are tales of jesters who, despite their twisted spines or missing limbs, learned to twist words even sharper. Better to mock your master lightly before he mocks you harder. And yet, hidden in the scrolls, are flickers of something else. A few disabled attendants gained a kind of trust that others never touched. Perhaps it was because no one expected them to be dangerous. Or perhaps their closeness, their ability to observe quietly while others dismissed them, made them valuable. Some even rose to wield subtle influence, slipping advice into a king's ear, shaping choices disguised as jokes. It sounds unlikely, but the more you read between the lines, the more you sense that power sometimes flowed from the least likely places. Still, court life was no sanctuary. The role given to you could shift overnight, depending on the ruler's mood. One day, you might be showered with food, cloaks, a small purse of coins. The next, you could be paraded like a trophy, made to dance while nobles sipped spiced wine and pretended not to notice the sweat dripping down your brow. It wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. Least they wouldn't have called it that. More like entertainment, with you at the center of the stage, whether you wished it or not. What makes it even more curious is how the chronicles themselves waver. Some depict the royal presence of disabled courtiers as a mark of the king's generosity, a sign that even those less whole could serve in noble halls. Others write of it with unease, as though it revealed something unsettling about power's hunger for spectacle. The truth is slippery, and even historians today can't quite agree whether to read those courtly roles as privilege or exploitation. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the shuffle of your step on marble floors, the ripple of laughter when you tilt your head at just the right moment. A lady-in-waiting hides her smile behind a jeweled hand, while a scribe scribbles faster, eager to note every clever turn of phrase. And somewhere, the king leans forward, amused or perhaps simply pleased that he owns this moment, owns you. But you learn, as always, how to bend with the gaze. You exaggerate a gesture, turn your stumble into a flourish. You lace your wit with enough truth to spark laughter, but not enough to spark anger. The line is thin, but balance it well, and you might leave the court with more than you came with. Food, shelter, even a sliver of safety. Not that the court ever stops being a cage. The silks are softer, the shadows warmer, but the bars are still there. You sense it every time a noble woman tilts her head and whispers, "Charming, isn't he?" Not to you, but about you. In their eyes, you are a story to be told at dinner, an anecdote to make their guests smile. The difference between the mud of the streets and the marble of the palace lies mostly in who is laughing, and what they hold in their hands when they do. And so, whether in rags among the market stalls or in ribbons beneath chandeliers, the performance never really ends. The gaze follows, transforms, but never lets go. The marble floors of the court fade behind you, but you barely get to savor the shift in air before another kind of performance begins. This time, it is not kings or nobles who direct the play, but the healers, the so-called keepers of wisdom, arriving with pouches that rattle and jars that smell like half-burned gardens. You sit where they tell you to sit, breathing in the sharp sting of rosemary, the damp weight of crushed moss, and the metallic bite of blood that always seems to close at hand. A man with wild hair, tied by a leather thong, crouches in front of you, holding up a vial as if sunlight itself might leak from it. He insists, in all seriousness, that if you drink this mixture of ground beetles and red wine while facing east at moonrise, your crooked limb will straighten. You try not to laugh, but you wonder if he made that up on the walk over. And then, before you can decide, another healer shuffles forward with a different promise, a charm carved into bone, a thread of silk to tie around your wrist, a prayer to whisper at dawn. By the end, you are less a patient than a walking chandelier of superstition, clinking and dangling with everyone's favorite remedy. It's not that they mean harm, at least not most of them. Some are genuinely kind, offering poultices of chamomile or marjoram that, if nothing else, soothe with their warm, grassy smell. When rubbed onto aching joints, they give you a moment's relief, and in a world as rough as this one, a moment matters. But the kindness is wrapped in something heavier. Every herb pressed into your hand, every stone tied to your neck carries the unspoken judgment. Your body is wrong, and they must make it right. You hear stories whispered in the markets. In one town, the local healer marched a limping boy to the churchyard and made him touch the bones of a long-dead saint, certain the relic's holiness would seep into his bones. In another, a barber surgeon declared he could cure seizures by cutting open the skull and letting out evil vapors. The boy did not walk again. Still, the crowd nodded, muttering that at least the attempt was made, because in a time when suffering was seen as punishment from heaven, anything, no matter how brutal, seemed worth trying to undo the curse. The inconsistency is dizzying. One physician prescribes sweetened milk mixed with crushed pearls because, of course, if you can't wear jewelry, you may as well drink it. Another insists on long pilgrimages, sending frail bodies hobbling over hills and valleys in search of a shrine. The trek exhausts more than muscles. It drains hope, too. Yet somehow, nestled in these contradictions, the simplest truth hides in plain sight. Sometimes the best cure is not pearls or prayers, but rest, food, and the kindness of being left in peace. Strangely, nobody carved that wisdom onto tablets, and you notice something peculiar. The crowd often matters more than you do. When a healer parades you into the square, chanting and sprinkling holy water, the onlookers lean in, sighing in relief. Not relief for you, but for themselves. It reassures them that the world is ordered, that suffering has a ritual to contain it. Perhaps that was the real medicine spectacle, not solution. The healer's performance calms the village, even as you limp home unchanged. Close your eyes. Imagine the prickle of smoke from dried sage smoldering in a clay bowl. The scratch of wool cords tied too tightly around your wrist. The sudden sting of a knife's edge when a barber decides to let the bad blood out. You hear the crowd murmur, feel their eyes on you, waiting to see if you will stand taller, walk straighter. You know you won't, but you also know they want the illusion more than the reality. In that sense, you're back on stage again, just like at court. Except the chandeliers have been replaced with torches and the nobles with neighbors. What makes it harder is the weight of expectation. You are supposed to hope for change, to want to be cured. Every potion offered, every ritual demanded, assumes that relief must equal transformation. But sometimes all you want is to be seen without pity, without the constant tug of improvement. To be treated as someone who belongs, not as someone who must be corrected. That truth is harder for them to swallow than powdered emeralds in honey water. And there is humor here, even if bitter. You picture today's hospitals with their antiseptic brightness, their neat rows of machines. Imagine a modern nurse walking in with a tray and saying, "Here's your infusion of crushed sapphires. Please sip slowly." You'd laugh until you remembered that somewhere online, someone probably is selling healing crystals with the same confidence as a medieval barber. Maybe the centuries are not as distant as we think. What lingers, as always, is the gaze. Not just the gaze of the healer, but of the community, watching, weighing, measuring whether your suffering has been contained. And so you learn again to perform. You wince at the right moment, sigh as though lighter, nod politely when they declare you improved. You know that the ritual is less about healing and more about maintaining the story that life makes sense. And in that story, your body is both the stage and the prop. Every scar, every limp, every twitch becomes evidence for someone's theory, proof of their charms, success, or failure. You are not just living, you are constantly being interpreted, like scripture, like a riddle, like a warning. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, even the historians can't quite agree. Were these cures acts of care or acts of control? The answer, like the smoke curling from a bowl of herbs, slips through your fingers just when you think you've caught it. So you walk on, carrying the smell of sage, the weight of charms, the faint ache of yesterday's treatment. And though you can't say you're healed, you are, in a way, tougher. Not because the remedies worked, but because you survived them. You breathe slowly, letting the strange smoke of herbs fade, the rattling charms tied around your neck settling into silence. The healer has gone, the smell of bitter roots lingers, and you are left, once again, with your own body, aching, imperfect, but still capable of something. In the medieval world, that something mattered. Work, after all, was the line between belonging and being cast aside, out in the fields. The soil never asked whether your back was bent by birth or by accident. The earth only asked to be turned. You see men with twisted legs pushing wooden plough handles with their shoulders. Children with one arm carrying baskets, awkwardly but determinedly. Women with limps, moving slowly yet steadily down rows of cabbages. There was no choice. If you could move, you worked. And if you worked, however crooked your stance, you still carried a kind of worth. Sometimes, the overseer of a manor would glance at you, squinting, perhaps uncertain if you would last the day. But then the sun rose higher, sweat stung your eyes, and you kept digging, or weeding, or gathering, and slowly suspicion softened. A hand that pulled weeds with 3 fingers instead of 5 still pulled them. A voice that stuttered still shouted warnings when the ox broke its tether. Work was currency, and you could trade your effort for acceptance, however grudging. The workshops told another story. Inside, the sound of hammers striking iron was deafening, sparks bursting into the dark corners. Some craftsmen were missing fingers, lost to accidents or frostbite, yet their other hand still held the hammer steady. Apprentices leaned closer, wide-eyed, learning from men whose bodies told the history of risk and resilience. In towns, a bent back could mean you were the cobbler who sat lower, closer to your leather. A crooked spine was just another shape bent over a bench, stitching shoes until the waxed thread burned your fingertips. And there were those extraordinary cases, whispered more than written down. Men who had lost parts of themselves in war, a hand, an eye, a leg, and yet returned to battle again. A one-eyed archer squinting down his bow, a limping soldier hobbling into formation. People did not always mock this. Sometimes they admired it, as though sheer stubbornness could hold back death itself. No historian can quite agree on how common it was, but there are traces of records that suggest whole groups of disabled veterans finding ways to keep fighting. Their scars carried like banners, yet you know, there was always the shadow of suspicion. Could you really be trusted to do the job? Would your slower pace cost the group? Sometimes neighbors grumbled, sometimes employers refused. But then there were households that needed every hand, every scrap of effort. and suddenly your imperfect body was not a burden, but a bargain. Better some work than none, they might mutter, handing you a hoe, pushing a bucket into your arms. It is strange, isn't it? How dignity could rest on something as small as whether you could haul a pail of water or mend a piece of cloth. If you could, you bought yourself a sliver of belonging. If you couldn't, you slipped closer to being an object of pity or ridicule. Work was not just survival, it was the fragile thread tying you to humanity in the eyes of others. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the rhythm, the thud of hoe into earth, the scrape of sickle through stalks, the hiss of breath pulled through teeth when a twisted limb trembled under strain. Each sound is steady, almost hypnotic. The village goes on around you, not with compassion, but with routine. And sometimes that is comfort enough. Of course, there were cruel ironies. Those who could not labor still found themselves demanded to prove worth in other ways, through begging songs, through humor, through storytelling. Yet for those who could work, however awkwardly, there was a kind of shield. A bent arm, yes, but a loaf on the table at day's end. A limp, yes, but also a place in the harvest celebration. A cup of ale passed hand to hand. You picture yourself sitting by the fire after a day's toil, hands blistered, body weary, but still inside the circle. The bread tastes coarse, but it is bread you helped to earn. You belong, however tenuously, and in that belonging there is relief. But the weight of it all presses down to, how many days can you keep this up? Will the overseer lose patience when your pace falters? Will the workshop choose a younger, stronger apprentice? You hear whispers sometimes of someone dismissed from the fields, left to wander the streets. That line is always there, thin and fragile, and so you push on. The rhythm of labor becomes the rhythm of survival. The medieval world does not pause to consider your limits. It only measures what you contribute. In that measurement, your body becomes both cage and key, hindrance and proof. You are worth as much as your work, and tomorrow the tally begins again. And as you drift on this thought, your breath slows, almost in sync with the swing of a sickle, the pull of a thread. The hum of survival softens the edges of fear. You feel the weight of your body, imperfect but undeniably present, undeniably alive. The fields fall quiet. Your body aches, your breath tastes of dust and straw, but for now, the days demands ease. You step away from the public eye, away from overseers and merchants, and into spaces less spoken about, the ones behind doors, under thatched roofs, within walls that creak with the weight of whispered kindness. In public, your worth is measured by sweat and coin, but behind closed shutters, something else stirs. Loyalty, affection, survival shared. You notice it in the way a neighbor leaves a piece of bread on your stool without remark, or how a cousin helps you across the threshold, their hand steadying your uneven step as though it were nothing. No audience, no applause, just quiet acts that slip past the judgment of the street. There is warmth in a pot of stew stretched further than it should have gone. A woman ladles it into a second bowl, setting it in front of you without looking up, as though the gesture was simply part of the recipe. A child pushes half his crust into your hand, grinning like it's a game, not charity. These moments blur the harsh lines of worth measured by labor, if only for a night, and yet you know the kindness is fragile. It lives in small gestures, not grand declarations. Too much strain, a poor harvest, a tax collector's knock, a sickness sweeping through the parish, and the warmth thins, patience cracks. Families hide what they can, but desperation eats through loyalty quickly. Still, the memory of shared bread can keep you standing on days when the streets grow cruel. Some chroniclers wrote about charitable guilds and parish funds, as though care for the poor and disabled was neatly organized. But if you listen closely, the truest aid often flowed not from official chests, but from neighbors too weary to be noticed. A sack of turnips left on your doorstep, a pair of patched shoes tucked beside your bed. Historians argue whether such gestures were common or rare, but in the hush of evening, what matters is how they felt. A lifeline braided from secrecy and compassion. Imagine now, sitting by the hearth. The room smells of smoke and cabbage. The shadows flicker along the rafters. Your family speaks in low voices, careful not to draw the attention of gossiping neighbors. You lean back against the wall, tired but safe. And for a moment you almost forget the stares, the laughter, the suspicion outside. The world narrows to firelight, to the soft clink of a spoon, to the hand that pushes the bowl closer to you. There were times when even landlords looked the other way. A farmer who could not meet his rent might be allowed to stay the winter, the scribe deliberately writing a softer figure in the margin. Was it mercy? Was it calculation, knowing that throwing someone out would shame the village? No one can say for certain, but those scribbles in old account books hint at something more complicated than cruelty alone, and sometimes the kindness carried risk. To give food to one who could not repay might anger others who whispered of favoritism, of wasted resources. A loaf given to you was a loaf not given to someone else. Families weighed these choices in silence, the balance of survival and conscience tilting in ways rarely recorded. The official stories celebrated great acts of charity from lords and ladies, but the truth breathed in smaller rooms, spaces where generosity whispered instead of shouted. You think of a neighbor helping you mend a fence post, hammering in silence so others wouldn't see. You think of a sister slipping coins into your pouch, pretending they'd been there all along. These are not grand tales for chronicles, yet they anchor you more than sermons ever could, and in this flickering safety, you begin to notice something subtle. Kindness reshapes the body, not with cures or miracles, but with dignity. The limp feels lighter when someone waits for you to catch up. The twisted hand steadies when another hand takes it without hesitation. Suffering does not vanish, but it shifts under the weight of being quietly shared. Still, the kindness never erases fear. You hear stories of families hiding disabled kin during times of famine, keeping them from view when charity inspectors came. Not cruelty, but protection, shielding you from being judged, weighed, and perhaps discarded. It is a paradox only a medieval household could carry. To love you fiercely but silently, because love spoken aloud could become dangerous. The church bells toll outside, echoing through stone walls. Tomorrow, sermons will speak of divine suffering, of charity as a duty. But tonight, here in the glow of embers, charity is not a sermon, but a bowl of broth, a patch of straw, a blanket drawn over your shoulders. And as your eyes grow heavy, you sense that these hidden gestures carry a truth bigger than any decree. Not every act of survival was public. Not every kindness was recorded. But in these hushed exchanges, humanity breathed. You lie down, the murmur of voices fading, and you drift with the warmth of those secret loyalties, invisible yet steady, like hands holding you from the edges of despair. The night grows deeper, and though the hearth still whispers, outside the world hums with stories. You feel it in the way people glance at you, not just as a neighbor, not merely as another hungry soul, but as a figure pulled halfway into the realm of omen and myth. In the medieval mind, bodies told stories louder than words, and yours, bent, limping, different, became a script others were far too eager to read. A crooked spine. That could mean your mother once angered a saint. A twisted hand. Proof that the devil had brushed too close in the cradle. Even a clouded eye was enough to spark whispers about curses carried in your blood. The logic wasn't logic at all, but folklore tied in knots, spilling into every glance that lingered on you too long. And yet, fear cuts both ways. Some avoided you as if you carried pestilence, moving aside when you approached, making the sign of the cross as though your shadow might cling to them. Others thought you could see what they could not. A limp could turn into the mark of a seer. A missing limb became the badge of one who had wrestled fate and survived. You were shunned and sought in the same breath, a contradiction baked deep into village gossip by the fire. Old women told tales of children born different who grew into saints, their wounds glowing with divine power. In the same breath, they told darker ones, spirits twisted into human flesh, omens of storms, living reminders that God's patience might be thinning. You became both miracle and warning, depending on who needed the story that night. Picture the market square on a damp morning. The cobblestones glisten, chickens scatter, traders call out their prices. A woman sees you pass and mutters that the skies will break before sundown, because your limp has always meant rain in her eyes. Across the square, another man presses a coin into your palm, convinced your touch will bring his daughter health. You can't win, but you also can't quite lose. You're trapped in the role of unwilling oracle, blamed and blessed in the same heartbeat. The line between fear and reverence blurred often. In chronicles, you sometimes glimpse figures described as touched by God, revered for surviving what should have killed them. Some of these men and women were welcomed into monasteries, their scars turned into relics of endurance. Others, with no such blessing, were driven into forests, their existence retold as cautionary tales to frighten children into obedience. The truth lay somewhere in the cracks. But those cracks are wide enough to swallow whole lives. And it wasn't just villagers with their gossip. Even kings and nobles wrapped stories around bodies. A hunchback in a court might be mocked, yes, but also feared, for who knew what fate his twisted shape foretold? Some rulers kept disabled people near, believing their presence could ward off bad luck, as though misfortune might cling to one figure instead of spreading to the crown. Strange superstition, yet powerful enough to shape lives. You remember sitting at a feast's edge once, watching torches blur in the smoke. Musicians played, wine spilled, laughter roared. A noble leaned over, staring at you as though reading a riddle. His whisper carried down the table. Keep him close, his crookedness turns curses aside. You weren't sure if it was protection or another prison. There's humor in it too, though bitter. Imagine today someone limping into a coffee shop and half the room thinking, storm's coming, or a neighbor deciding you must have Wi-Fi signals trapped in your bones. Ridiculous now, but not so far from the medieval logic you face each morning. And while you might laugh at the absurdity, the weight of those whispers presses hard when repeated often enough. One strange detail hides in the records. In some villages, disabled bodies were chosen to lead processions meant to drive away evil. Picture it, you, walking at the front, bells tied to your wrists, people following with candles and chants. Were you honored, or merely used as a lightning rod for dread. The line is impossible to pin down, and maybe that was the point. Fear needs symbols, and you were convenient. Even the animals seemed drawn into the stories. A dog following you might be called a guardian spirit. A crow perching near your hut could convince neighbors that you trafficked with witches. You could not control any of it, and yet the narrative stuck to you like mud after rain. Some feared touching you at all. Others touched you too often, as if your body were a relic to rub for luck. Both left marks you couldn't wash away. But in these shifting tales, there was also a kind of resilience. If the world insisted you were marked, you learned to wield it. A glare could silence a mocking child, because didn't everyone say, your eyes saw storms before they came? A muttered prayer in your presence might earn you bread, and bread meant survival. You leaned into the myth. Not because you believed it, but because sometimes bending a story is easier than breaking it. And so you live, balanced between terror and awe, feared as a curse and clung to as a charm. You never asked for this role, yet it trails you like a cloak, woven from every tale whispered when the fire burns low. The bells outside call again, summoning the faithful to prayer. But inside your chest, another sound lingers, the echo of stories heavier than stone, painting you as monster and miracle in the same breath. You slip from the street, dusted with soot, into a house that smells faintly of lavender, polish, and coal smoke. The air is warmer, thicker, almost heavy with the hum of voices that never quite speak their true thoughts aloud. Here, in the polished drawing room, you are meant to sit straight, keep your ankles neatly aligned, and pretend the city beyond those velvet curtains does not exist. The carpet muffles your steps, and the firelight dances over the gilt-framed mirrors, multiplying your reflection into a softer, wealthier version of yourself. Tea is poured in thin porcelain cups, so delicate you're half convinced a sigh would crack them. Sugar cubes plop in with the sound of quiet indulgence tiny. Luxuries in a city where children lick soot off bricks to fool their stomachs. You take a sip, burning your tongue, but of course you smile as though pain is fashionable. The drawing room itself feels like a stage, doesn't it? Gentle laughter at carefully chosen moments, eyes darting to the piano as someone plays a waltz too softly to drown the gossip. The curtains stay drawn, shutting out the fog, but everyone here pretends they are immune to it, as though social standing makes lungs stronger. A gentleman leans toward you, whispering about politics in a voice low enough that his wife can pretend not to hear. Secrets curl around the room like cigar smoke, settling in the folds of gowns and the corners of smiles. And here is something you'd never expect. Many homes had small withdrawing rooms that were originally meant only for women, where they could escape the men after dinner. Over time, these rooms evolved into these elegant drawing rooms you now sit in, spaces of performance disguised as leisure. People still debate whether the word drawing comes from withdrawing or from the act of drawing people together. But, of course, no one here wants to appear uncertain about anything. Certainty is its own kind of ornament. The conversation drifts from opera tickets to speculation about who is visiting whom after dusk. You notice a fan snapping open, not for the warmth, but for coded messages. Yes, fans were practically telegraphs in silk and ivory. Tilt one this way, you're flirting. Close it with a snap, you're offended. The trick is not letting your hand tremble. Yours, sadly, does though, whether from nerves or the tea's sharp edge of caffeine. You can't say ... Your eyes wander. A small portrait on the wall stares back at you, its subject long gone, yet still attending every gathering. The host notices and murmurs, almost lazily, that the sitter was an aunt who died of a weak chest. The phrase, spoken so casually, conceals years of coughing fits and doctors prescribing seaside air. How polite, you think, to fold tragedy into such a neat phrase. It's as though sorrow itself has to mind its manners. You stifle a yawn, though not from boredom rather, from the gentle rhythm of voices blending with the fire's crackle. Your head almost tips, but you catch yourself. Falling asleep at a social call would be unforgivable. Or perhaps it would be the most honest thing you could do in a room where every gesture is a disguise. Even here, away from the grime, the soot still finds you. A faint smudge on a gown hem, a darkened edge on the window pane, a cough hastily hidden behind lace. Secrets are never as tidy as these rooms wish them to be. And as you place your cup back on the saucer, you sense it the weight of watching eyes. The shared understanding that appearances are everything, even as they crack at the edges. You step outside the glow of chandeliers, and the polished whispers vanish. The city folds back into its rougher skin. Beneath the soot-dark sky, your thoughts wander further back, centuries earlier, to a world that did not shine with velvet curtains and porcelain cups. A world where life could turn against you the moment you were born different. Imagine this: a small stone cottage, its hearth cold more often than warm. A child, swaddled in linen, is passed from hand to hand. The midwife's face flickers as she notices a crooked limb or eyes that do not align, or breath that falters. Whispers begin at once, signs, omens, punishments from God. In this world, being different is rarely seen as simply human. It is cast instead as divine judgment or a devil's prank. You feel the weight of those stares, the hush of neighbors who never quite look you in the eye. Church bells toll in the distance, and each sound is heavy with rules. Faith dictates more than prayer. It molds how people understand the body itself. A child born blind is called touched by the heavens. A child unable to walk is said to carry the family's sins in their bones. Some families keep such children close, shielding them with fierce devotion. Others, well, the silence in those cottages says enough. Yet it wasn't always cruelty. Some monasteries opened their doors, offering care, though care often meant little more than food, a pallet to sleep on, and the endless reminder of charity's power. You sit in the cloister's echo, the cold stone pressing against your back, hearing footsteps of monks who believed that to serve the weak was to serve Christ himself. Still, even there, pity was the price of survival. You were never simply a person, you were a symbol, carrying meaning for others to interpret. One detail you might not expect: medieval law sometimes allowed those deemed fools, or differently minded, certain freedoms denied to others. They could speak out in ways that would have cost another man his life. Their words, dismissed as nonsense, occasionally slip truths past the ears of lords. It's strange, isn't it, that what was called weakness could sometimes carry a strange, crooked power. But superstition ran deep. If a storm struck, or livestock sickened, glances shifted toward the child who limped, or the woman whose hands trembled uncontrollably. People debated in hushed tones whether such souls were blessed or cursed, though rarely did anyone ask the person themselves. And you, sitting there, feel the ache of being both watched and invisible, judged without ever being heard. Picture a village feast, meat roasting, ale foaming, laughter loud enough to spill into the night, And yet, at the edges of the firelight, a boy sits apart, his twisted foot keeping him from the games. Someone brings him bread, more out of habit than kindness. He eats quickly, quietly, the way one does when gratitude is expected. The music plays on. His absence from the dance is barely noticed, but his presence is never forgotten. It lingers like a question people would rather not answer. What does it mean to be marked from birth? To carry every superstition, every sermon, every sideways glance in your own skin? The air feels heavier as you ask it. The silence is not empty, it hums with centuries of stories half told, hidden or erased. And so you walk on, carrying that silence with you, knowing it has not vanished. It only changes shape. The silence you carry does not stay in the Middle Ages. It clings to you like a shadow as you step forward, into streets that no longer stink of dung and smoke, but still hum with the same uneasy questions. The cobblestones have turned into pavement, the cottages into towers of glass. Yet that look, that sideways glance, you felt it before. You still feel it now. A mother pulls her child a little closer on the subway. A stranger speaks, just a touch louder to you, as if difference means deafness. At the edge of an office party, you watch laughter form circles that do not quite open. Oh yes, society has moved on, or so it likes to announce. But some of the old whispers have merely learned to wear modern clothes. Still, there is something different in the air. You notice it in classrooms where children are taught that variety is not curse but color, in doorways widened, in ramps added, in hands that reach not to push away but to pull in. Progress is not a feast where everyone has eaten their fill, but you can at least smell the bread baking. And after centuries of hunger, that is no small thing. One image lingers, a medieval child sitting apart at a village feast, chewing quickly so gratitude will be visible on his face. Now, picture another child sitting in a cafeteria centuries later. She wheels herself forward, balancing a tray, her friends waving her over. She laughs, spills juice, makes a mess. Nobody treats it as divine omen. It's just Tuesday. Somehow, that small moment feels like a triumph greater than banners and the trumpets. Historians like to argue over timelines when the shift began. Who pushed hardest, whether pity had to crawl before rights could run. But as you sit here, breathing softly, you realize the debate matters less than the pulse underneath. Human dignity is no longer something granted. It is claimed, and yet, the echo of older worlds doesn't vanish. You hear it when stories in the news frame someone as inspirational simply for existing. You hear it in jokes tossed carelessly, in systems still built for bodies that fit only one design. The medieval shadow stretches long, reminding you how stubborn prejudice can be. But the light stretches too. You feel it when a neighbor knocks to ask nothing more than if you'll join them for dinner, no strings attached. You feel it in the quiet revolution of language, words shifting from burden to person, from broken to whole. You feel it in your own bones, knowing that to be different is no longer to be doomed, but to live fully, sometimes even fiercely, with no apology. And so you exhale. The journey you've walked from muddy streets and gawking crowds, through royal courts and twisted medicines, past folklore and sermons, across fields and workshops, into cloisters and cottages, leads you here, to this moment in which survival is no longer the only victory. Living itself has become a story worth whispering into the dark. You close your eyes, letting the centuries settle around you. They are heavy, yes, but they are also proof. Proof that cruelty is not fixed, that pity can loosen its grip, that kindness once hidden can stretch out into daylight. Proof that you are more than an echo, more than a symbol. You are, quite simply, human, and the world, at long last, is beginning to see you that way.